The exercise of faith is near and dear to the heart of God. In fact, the writer of the Hebrews goes so far as to say, without faith, it's impossible to please God. Impossible. Why would that be? Why would it be impossible to please him without faith? Well, it points us back to an important foundational principle that we need to come back to, not infrequently. That first and foremost, and above everything else, God desires a relationship with us. It's important in our theology to always come back to that touchstone, that the beginning and the foundation of everything is his desire for a relationship with us. It was his purpose for making us, and it is his purpose in redeeming us. God is intensely relational. A plurality of personhood, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, an eternal relationship and fellowship with one another. That's the Godhead. Out of which, by the way, be reminded, there was no lack. In creating us and inviting us into that eternal fellowship, it wasn't because God lacked anything. He was fully complete and fully satisfied. But out of the sheer goodness to extend himself, he created us and invited us into that, to become, in the words of Peter, those important words, participants in the divine nature. In the term that was often used by Charles Williams, who was one of C.S. Lewis's buddies, part of that little Inklings group, he often quoted it was from the patristic fathers, but it was a term he often used, co-inherence, meaning that God created us to actually become part of that divine fellowship and communion with him for all time and eternity. It is at the very heart and center of God's nature and purpose. Given that, trust is the foundation of all relationship. Relationship cannot exist without trust. It's impossible. Faith, more than anything else, fundamentally, is about trust, about the foundation of a relationship with God. As the writer of Hebrews then goes on to say, anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Seek him. That's why we're told that when God took the aged and childless Abraham outside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can, if indeed you can, so shall your offspring be. And we're told in the next line, Abraham believed the Lord, trusted him, and God credited to him as righteousness. Relationship with God, trust, is the foundation of our righteousness before God, which is by faith, believing, and trusting. Which brings us to Naomi. Her faith had been shattered by the crushing loss of her husband and only sons, on top of an already difficult, painful, disruptive life, to the point that she, as we saw, could no longer trust God for herself. It had been the faith of her Moabite, foreign, non-Jewish daughter-in-law that had carried her and sustained her when her own faith would not and could not. It had been the faith of Ruth that had declared undying faithfulness to Naomi. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. It had been the faith of Ruth that had sustained Naomi in those days. It had been the faith of Ruth that had taken the initiative to say, I will go and glean behind someone who will show me favor. But it had been the faithfulness of God, of God's providential hand, guiding Ruth to the field of Boaz, who had demonstrated such unusual compassion and kindness, and who, come to find out, was one of their guardian redeemers, that has suddenly awakened and restored the shattered faith of Naomi, that she could believe and trust God once again. Let me pause there for a moment to just point out, Ruth could not do that for her. Could not. When someone's faith is shattered, only God can repair that. All Ruth could do was be faithful. Faithful to God, faithful to her. But the work of restoring Naomi's shattered faith was the work of God, which he did. So he sustained Naomi through the faith and faithfulness of Ruth, and he restored her faith through the providential events that were made possible through that faith and faithfulness of Ruth. So don't miss that. Here's what makes, I think, this story so beautiful. None of what happened in chapters 3 and 4 would have happened apart from the faith and faithfulness of Ruth that was exercised when Naomi's was completely shattered. Ruth's faithfulness and the circumstances that brought about made possible the recovery of Naomi's faith. Only God could do that, but he worked through the instrumentality and circumstances of Ruth's faith and faithfulness. However, nothing that happens in chapter 3 and 4 would have been possible without the faith and faithfulness that Naomi now exercised in return. Isn't that beautiful? So it oscillates back and forth. Now recovered, Naomi takes center stage, which brings us to Ruth chapter 3, verse 1. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." Notice significantly the change in the story. It is now Naomi who surprisingly takes the initiative. She says to Ruth, "I must find a home where you will be provided for." Home is literally the Hebrew word for a resting place. It meant a place of permanence, of safety, of security, of provision. It meant all of that. A place where she would be secure and in the future would be well provided for. Ruth had pledged to Naomi, "Where you die, I will die. Where you're buried, I will be buried." What she was promising Naomi is that she would care for her until her dying day. She would never forsake her. But now Naomi turns the table and pledges to Ruth that she will see to it that Ruth is cared for after she is gone. She would not leave Ruth as an unprotected widow, as a desolate, unprotected widow in a foreign land, foreign to her. The faithfulness of Ruth toward Naomi is now answered by the faithfulness of Naomi toward Ruth. I would just remind you that when her faith was shattered, Naomi had urged Ruth to return to her home because she had no hope of any prospect for Ruth. But now, with a renewed faith, all of that had changed, and she responds in faith with faithfulness to Ruth. My daughter, I must find a resting place for you. And she has a plan, pretty elaborate plan. And she lays out the details of that plan very clearly and very specifically to Ruth. Verse 2. Now Boaz, this is again Naomi speaking to Ruth. Now Boaz, with those women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know that you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go over and uncover his feet and lie down. And he will tell you what to do. That was the plan. Ruth has no clue what that really means, what it's all about. All she knows is that Boaz is their relative. She's to bathe herself, put on fragrant perfume, her best clothes. She's to observe the going-ons while remaining undetected. By the way, the process of winnowing grain was the joyous, festive occasion of harvest on the threshing floor, because they would separate the grain from their shells. The afternoon breeze would blow it away. They would gather it. This was the culmination of the fruit of harvest. And then every night that they did that was party time. They would eat and drink, and they would celebrate the joy of the ingathering of their harvest. So she's to watch that. Naomi knows that Boaz will be there for that. And she's to watch where he lays down for the night, but remain undetected. And then under the cover of darkness, she's to go to him and uncover his feet, presumably so that at some point in the cold of the night, it will awaken him. And then he will sense something laying at his feet and find out that it is her. And then he will tell her what to do next. Almost reminds you of a scene out of a James Bond movie, clandestine, under the cover of darkness. Here's your mission. Here's what you're to do. You're not going to be told everything, but down the road, somebody will tell you the next thing to do. Mystery, intrigue, suspense. Verse 5, Ruth responded, I will do whatever you say. Ruth answered. It was an elaborate, detailed, well thought out plan. But of course, the question is why? What was it all for? What did it mean? And what was its purpose? You'll remember that when Ruth returned from gleaning and told Naomi that the name of the man with whom she had worked was Boaz, Naomi had responded that Boaz was one of their guardian redeemers, or you may be familiar with it as kinsman redeemer in other translations. The Hebrew term was the term goel. Some of you know that and have heard that. It was a legal term, very specific legal term, in an important area of family law. The family was the building block of society, as it really is in every time and culture. And the clan was the guardian of the well-being of the family. So the Goel, and this is from both Leviticus and from the book of Deuteronomy, the Goel had three primary responsibilities. If an Israelite, because of financial difficulty, was forced to sell his land, he retained the right to redeem that land at a later point, buy it back. If he was unable, And the Goel had the means. The Goel was to purchase that land back, restoring it back to the family and restoring the wholeness of the clan. Number one. Number two, if an Israelite, because of financial difficulty, was forced to sell him or herself into slavery, the Goel, when and if they could, was to redeem or to buy back the relative or family member from slavery. Again, to restore the family and restore the wholeness of the clan. If an Israelite, number three, if an Israelite died without a male heir, the Goel was expected to marry the widow of the deceased, and the first male born would be considered the heir of the deceased male and would carry on his name and his estate. Again, preserving the wholeness of the family, which in turn would preserve the wholeness of the clan, which in turn, by the way, would preserve the wholeness of the nation. Pretty important, isn't it? We all know that. Now, that last one may sound a little strange to us, to our modern ears and sensibilities, but I once heard of something fairly equivalent. We had an elderly couple live a few houses down from us for a period of time who had come from Texas. They had come in their later years to be close to their son. Their names were Walter and Mildred Vest. I'll never forget them. They were just those classic distinguished Texans, just refined and only as Texans can be. Mildred had a blonde turned silver, thick head of hair that she wore in a huge bun that stood up on the top of her head, and they were just dignified. They always walked holding hands. Never saw them not holding hands together. They were in their latter years. I just enjoyed them very much. I was out one day and Walter was by himself, which didn't happen often, and we were having a conversation. The conversation went on pretty well, and he opened up and told me a story I'd never heard before. He was an engineer in the oil fields of Texas, successful, happy in his work, traveled around the world, was a confirmed bachelor, had no need, intent, or desire to be anything else. He thought he could give himself fully to his work. He was quite happy with his life, felt like he was free to go and do what he wanted to do. But his brother had 4 children, and he died suddenly. And at some point down the road, he was helping to try to care for his brother's family. The thought came into his head that maybe he ought to, for the sake of his brother, take Mildred as his own and her 4 kids and raise them. That's what he did. He and Mildred met, talked about it, decided, you know what, that would probably be a really reasonable and helpful thing to do. And then I'll never forget his next line. I'll never forget this. And he looked at me and he said, you know, Billy, he said, by and by, we came to love each other. I'll never forget that line. By and by, we came to love each other. It was a marriage of convenience, a marriage of necessity, but it became a deep love story. So I never think of this without thinking of that. It was the kind of sense of duty and responsibility. But what complicated the situation was that Ruth was a Moabite, not a Jew. Not a favored people, by the way, by any means. Though she was deserving and entitled to the care of a Goel, her ethnicity was a significant complicating factor. Which brings us to the why. Why the covert nature of their actions and the secrecy? Well, it speaks to the risk and danger that were involved, and it was risky. If others knew or found out what they were doing, it could be easily misinterpreted and easily misconstrued, resulting in the loss of a fragile reputation with pretty significant implications on what might be available to them in the future. As a foreigner, Ruth could have easily ended up ostracized, which would have been devastating to their circumstances and their predicament. There was no guarantee of a favorable outcome with Boaz. There were many justifiable reasons why he might refuse. There was a reasonable confidence that he was an honorable man. He had shown that. And that at the very least, there was a confidence that they would not suffer the loss of reputation. However, they did risk the favor that Boaz had shown them with no assurance that anyone else would show them that same kind of favor. That was on the line. Well, you say to yourself, they had nothing to lose. Actually, they had everything to lose. They were risking the only thing that they had right now was the favor and kindness of Boaz, and potentially more if it became known to the community. But this was the only possibility that existed for them. And they were betting it all on it. They were betting it all on the hesed, the faithfulness of Boaz, but in reality, they were betting it all on the hesed of God, weren't they? On his faithfulness. With that, the operation launched. Verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything, her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached him quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." At that point in the story, Ruth significantly went off script. She'd been told by Naomi that Boaz would tell her what to do. But she makes absolutely clear that what she is asking, she wants to make absolutely clear what she is asking of Boaz. She was asking for marriage. That is what was signified in the spreading of the garment over her. That was Middle Eastern practice. And not merely that he take her in whatever way he might, but that he would be the goel specifically of their family, including Naomi. Nothing less than that. Nothing short of that. She wanted that absolutely clear. She wanted absolutely no misunderstanding about that. And this was Boaz's response, verse 10. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier." This kindness, this hesed, that's the word again, is greater than that which you showed earlier. You've not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who's more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. So he does two things. He commends her that her hesed now shown was even greater than the hesed that she had shown earlier. She had no obligation herself to marry the Goel. She was a free agent, essentially. And Boaz seems to imply that she could have got somebody younger and richer and better looking than him. But she had made her own pleasure and happiness secondary to the honor of her late husband and the faithful care of her mother-in-law. And he recognizes that. And he assured her that she need not fear, that he will do all that she asks, and that nothing in her actions in any way lessened her excellent reputation, nor his desire to do so. With one caveat: there was a relative more closely related, and that relative would have to be given the right of first refusal if he was to exercise integrity. And he would exercise absolute integrity in faith, committing that decision, that eventuality, to the faithfulness of God. And let me just say that true faith has no need to compromise integrity ever, ever. So verse 14, she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized, and he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. He also said, bring me the shawl that you're wearing and hold it out. And when she did, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law Naomi, asked her, how did it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. He gives her 2 specific directions. First, that no one is to know that she's been there. That might have complicated the situation, but more likely might have influenced or manipulated the situation to the end that Boaz might have desired. Boaz is determined to leave it completely in the hand of God. True faith also never needs to manipulate an end. It trusts completely. Second of all, she's to take the grain that he's given her and tell Naomi specifically that he had said she was not to return to her mother-in-law empty-handed. That was a sign. That was the signal from Boaz to Naomi that one way or another, her emptiness was going to end. Let me step back for a moment to think about the lessons of this story. And I'm going to lift out 3 of them in particular. Faith is often, this is the first, faith is often at its best and greatest in times of the worst and hardest. Faith is often at its best and greatest in times of the worst and hardest. This was great faith. It was daring faith. It happened against a backdrop of enormous loss and difficulty in the midst of great need and great vulnerability, as faith exercised often does. In fact, I would suggest to you that experience and scripture and history tells us that times of peace and prosperity are much more precarious to the state and condition of our faith than times of hardship and adversity. It is much more of a challenge to maintain a robust faith in good times than it is in hard times. The children of Israel were warned by Moses, when you've come into this good land and you've settled in and you've built your houses and you've established your vineyards and everything is good, be careful that you don't forget the Lord. It was A.W. Tozier who said that for every 99 that can handle adversity, there's one who can handle prosperity, he said. The precariousness of David's faith occurred not when he was on the run from Saul, but when he was in his palace having achieved everything that you could possibly want to achieve. Which is why James tells us, count it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kind, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Count it all joy, pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Are you distraught about the election? Do you believe it's gloom and doom now? Okay, I'm not going to argue with you about that. Let me ask you this. How are you responding to that? I'm not presuming that's the case. I'm asking, if that is the case, how are you responding to that? My observation, there's a lot of hand wringing going on. James says, count it all joy when you encounter various trials. Oh, well, those politics is not those trials. Oh, really? In fact, he says, count it all joy when you encounter all kinds of trials of all various kinds. What an opportunity. That's how James looks at it. Are you fed up with the pandemic? Join the club. We're all fed up with it, aren't we? We are fed up with it. Okay? Let me ask you, how are you responding? Count it pure joy, knowing that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. I'm looking for the joy. I'm not seeing it. I see a lot of hand wringing and I see a lot of complaining. I don't see a lot of what Scripture tells us should be our response to those circumstances that we find ourselves in the midst of. The election and the pandemic are not the enemies of our faith. They are the opportunity for our faith to be tested, to be put to work, to be exercised, and to be demonstrated, to be made mature and complete. And let me remind you that there is nothing more pleasing to God than that. So that's the first thing. Faith is often at its best and greatest in times of the worst and the hardest. Number two, true faith is never presumptuous, but it is daring. There is a quality of daringness, or I might put it another way, of abandonment in faith, of casting yourself upon God. That's so evident in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, that Noah, when warned about things not seen, that Abraham obeyed, though he did not know where he was going. There was a reasonableness, I think, that what Naomi had seen in the providential hand of God guiding Ruth to Boaz in his response had not only restored her faith, but had given her a glimpse or a vision of what God might be about. But God didn't bring that about without the exercise of her faith. And it was a daring act of faith on her part. A faith that was directly related to her faithfulness, her desire to make sure that Ruth was cared for. That is a trust, that abandonment is rooted in a trust that is confident of the faithfulness or the hesed of God. And then thirdly, that true faith manifests itself in uncompromising faithfulness. Let me say that again. True faith manifests itself in uncompromising faithfulness. And that was evidenced in both Ruth and Boaz, who neither would entertain the thought of a shortcut to the end that they desired. Ruth wanted to ensure that Boaz understood the full meaning of what she was doing. That had not been part of the script that Naomi had given to her, but she wanted him to understand this was about nothing less than marriage and his responsibilities as Goel. And Boaz, in integrity and honor, would make sure that if this came about, that it was God's doing, without any shortcuts or attempts to manipulate the end result. So that is the opportunity that we have today and this week before us and the weeks and the months ahead. Reminded that oftentimes God's people have found themselves in less than ideal circumstances and situations, and may we be encouraged to be about, in faith and by faith, what he desires for us and through us and in us in these days and weeks ahead. Would you pray with me?